40 years ago this summer, Ronald Reagan, the then American president, gave a speech in which he delivered one of his most enduring witticisms. "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are," he said, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Thought of that quote this week when listening to voice after voice on the airwaves complaining that by waiting weeks for Andy Burnham to take over, the British government would be paralysed by inertia. Nothing would get done. This was considered to be a bad thing, whereas in fact government doing nothing, leaving people to get on with their own lives without endless tinkering from above, may actually be a very good thing. Nowhere is this more true than at the BBC, an institution which, in a few months, celebrates its centenary. Well, 100 years ago, the world into which the BBC was born was a very different place. It was a world of deference, of paternalism, of knowing your place, where BBC radio newsreaders were ordered to wear white tie and tails, even though the listeners couldn't see them. Standards, old boy. As John Reith, the BBC's first Director-General, famously remarked, the BBC has never attempted to give the public what it wants. It gives the public what it ought to have. A century on, and the dicky-bows and the clipped accents have gone, but the corporation is as sententious as it's ever been. In fact, it believes more than ever that the public must get what the BBC decides the public should get, not what the public necessarily wants, no matter how much the public protests. Not just the BBC that's convinced that the BBC has a divine right to impart knowledge and information. It's also our Labour government, this Labour government, which shares many of the BBC's values. The two are increasingly indivisible, united in, amongst other things, a deep fear, deep loathing at the prospect of a reform UK government, which would spell the end, not just for this Labour administration, but the BBC as we know it as well. Which is why I urge you to watch as attentively as you can over the next couple of years for signs of Labour not just defending the BBC, but entrenching its power and extending its influence. That is going to sound loopy to lefties. They will argue that the BBC is currently fighting for its life and losing. Earlier this month, the corporation announced nearly 2,000 job losses. It faces a $10 million lawsuit for defaming Donald Trump. The number of households paying the licence fee has fallen 10% in as many years, during which time, coincidentally, trust in the BBC has halved. A study published back in March found that no other British institution, save for the government itself, had suffered such a drastic fall in public respect. Our loss of faith in the BBC, however, is its rivals' gain. Streaming giants like Netflix are doing what Ronald Reagan would have wanted, showing us that the market will provide a high-quality service without the help of anyone from the government or public sector. But the lefties, who look at all this and fear the corporation's days are numbered, they're wrong, they're dead wrong. Reports of the BBC's demise are, I'm afraid, grossly exaggerated. The corporation may have its back against the wall, but in many respects its power isn't waning, it's waxing. For 2 reasons. First, because the BBC, never shy of throwing its weight around, has, I would argue, been abusing its market dominance in recent years, expanding into areas it's got no right to go. I'll come to this, more of this in a moment. Second, the BBC, and this is really quite a new development, is being given a leg up by a Labour Party terrified that Britain is learning to think for itself again, thanks to the internet. Let me start with that second point first, because given the hullabaloo in Westminster this week, it was really easily missed. In one of his final acts before confirming his resignation, Keir Starmer also announced that he wanted to artificially boost the BBC's profile on social media and video websites like Facebook and YouTube. One of the problems with Number 10 turning into a 1970s Latin American-style revolving door is that we are getting more short-lived premierships which wrap up with a frustrated Prime Minister desperate to secure a legacy. It's extraordinarily conceited. We saw it with Rishi Sunak's unworkable plans to stop future adults from smoking, and Starmer's idea, which would see social media platforms forced to algorithmically prioritise the BBC's output to counter what Labour calls disinformation. It's a real stinker. Labour says the new rules would make it easier for Britons to discover, as they put it, discover trusted news sources online. You might say amen to that. Great idea. Anything which helps us wade through the swamps of fake news in search of facts, that's to be commended. But you will have spotted the flaw, I think, in Keir Starmer's cunning plan, because one man's meat is another's poison. One man's disinformation is another man's truth. The BBC wants you to believe it's got the market, in truth, cornered. It's why, without a whiff of self-awareness, it launched the absurdly pompous BBC Verify service 3 years ago, as if the BBC, and only the BBC, can decide on what the truth looks like. If you'll permit me a digression, the search for the truth is a very old one. The ancient Greeks talked about little else. When Pontius Pilate was asked to decide whether Jesus Christ was telling the truth, he asked, or so the Bible tells us, what is the truth? What is the truth? In other words, it's subjective. For most of our island story, we've understood this to be an obvious verity. It's why we set out to search for the truth, not by consensus, but by disputation, in disagreement. This tension is built into our oldest institutions. So in the courts, we have a prosecution and defence. One side makes their case, the other presents alternative facts. In Parliament, there are government ministers. On one side, they argue black is white, while on the opposition benches, they contend that white is black. Who decides? Who decides what the truth is? The jurors and voters, respectively. Since the invention of the printing press, that was also how pamphleteers and, in time, newspapers worked. Even today, the world looks very different whether you read The Guardian or The Daily Telegraph, The Mirror or The Sun. All that started to unravel a century ago, as the decades passed, the BBC came to see itself not as one voice among many, but the only voice people should trust, because people couldn't be trusted to work out where the truth lies all by themselves, even though they'd been doing it for centuries in courtrooms and elections. The truth became what the Radio 2 announcer told you over your cornflakes, or the 9 o'clock news presenter on TV had to tell you as you sat in your comfortable armchair, perhaps puffing on your pipe. This was pre-Rishi Sunak, obviously. The problem with this idea, the idea that the BBC knows best, is that it keeps colliding with reality, and of late these collisions have grown more frequent. You hear about the noisy ones, that the BBC's editing of a Trump speech to make it sound as if he were inciting a crowd rather than inviting them to protest peacefully. The scandal over Hugh Edwards. The deeply one-sided reporting of the Gaza conflict, which saw BBC Arabic forced to correct, on average, 2 stories every week. The leaked memo from an internal BBC investigation, which found that the BBC's LGBT desk, they have one, subjected anything BBC News said about trans issues to censorship. Not even The Guardian has an LGBT desk, by the way. I could go on. I will go on. There was the BBC's coverage of the 2015 migrant crisis, which insisted that migrants would be a boon for Britain, whether we wanted them here or not. And then there was the Brexit vote. One study of BBC Output found that fractionally more than 3%, I don't have a graphic, so I'm going to use my fingers to reinforce the point, 3% of guests on one flagship news programme were Eurosceptic. That's not balance. That's propaganda. Occasionally, the BBC will clutch its pearls and reflect on how far the dream of objectivity has veered from the reality of bias. It commissions reports, the Tate Report, the Wilson Report, to name but 2 which were quietly filed away. The scandals are sometimes so serious that heads must roll, as with the Trump speech debacle. But often the scandals scarcely make a headline, even less an inquiry. This month, for instance, the Daily Telegraph reported that producers from a BBC children's show met with a charity that seeks to change attitudes to asylum seekers. Why were they doing that? A low-level, daily drumbeat of editorial nudges. You can hear it in the tone of BBC newsreaders, the way they shade certain words, make some stories jolly and upbeat, others grim and ironical. It's there in the language that's used to describe some parties, not all. As Kate Hoey, the former Labour MP, asked this month, why do BBC reporters always refer to Reform as a right-wing party but never the Greens, Lib Dems or Labour as a left-wing party? She might just as well have asked why some think tanks or campaign groups are routinely referred to as right-wing, while others are described, if they're described at all, as independent. This problem is endemic. The BBC has more than 21,000 employees and many more who subcontract their services. Young staff, they're often woke, diverse in appearance, but pretty alike in thinking. Many increasingly feel that coverage must reflect their own personal values, whether they are producers or commissioning editors or guest bookers. These BBC staff frequently feel it is their moral duty not to give a platform to views that emanate from the right or British politics, or they would say far right, wouldn't they? Because they'd see things. These BBC staff, perhaps, maybe they're better called activists, they are at the end point of a cultural evolution spawned on university campuses. They arrive at the BBC armed with a worldview which sees those they disagree with ideologically, not simply as wrong, but bad. Ventilating those views or sharing those views with viewers is to suffer a kind of form of harm. By all means, these people can think whatever codswallop they like. Just don't tap me and millions more for the licence fee to fund your sixth form agitprop. But the problem isn't just on the shop floor, it's all the way up, especially within the news division. The brilliant Rod Liddell, who once edited Radio 4's Today programme, tells a story about being summoned into the office of a senior BBC manager who wanted to lecture editors on the need to treat a forthcoming American presidential election impartially. He did so, said Rod, sitting at a desk in his office in front of a wall plastered with posters from Democrat election campaigns, some of which he'd worked on. Why have BBC staff become so partial? Lots of reasons. Not all of which actually are confined to the BBC. I wouldn't want to overdo this, but not so very long ago, journalism was more of a trade practiced by young men and women who'd left school at 16, whose only ambition was to remain in the town of their birth and report its activities, its doings, faithfully. University, and especially university media studies courses, have changed all that. The courses encourage groupthink. Universities encourage debt. Why does that matter? Well, there's not a lot of money in the media these days compared to what there was. So, to an extent, journalism has become a middle-class hobby requiring parental subsidies. And the problem with a media class that sees its work not as a vocation, but as a sort of diversion from the realities of the grubby business of making money, is that it becomes separated from the people who matter most. The customers. I think quite a few BBC staff hold not just their customers, but the very idea of customers in open contempt. Why is that such a problem? Because it means that customers, the number of viewers, listeners, they stop being seen as the measure of success. This is especially true of the BBC because at the BBC, you don't worry so much about where the cash is coming from because your income is guaranteed by the licence fee. What happens when an organisation stops giving a toss about its customers, especially when the number of those customers is actually falling like a stone? How do you then justify your salary, your guaranteed pension, your LGBT desk, when customers are switching off in record numbers? Simple. You switch the metric. More and more, what matters at the BBC is the approval of industry colleagues, your peers in the newsroom. Who cares if the plebs find your coverage of net zero one-sided or your unwillingness to engage with the street-level realities of mass migration blinkered? What matters is not what the great unwashed think, it's what your counterparts at Sky News or Channel 4 or Good Morning Britain think. It's what the people who sit on the panels that decide who gets a BAFTA think. But the thing about Sky and GB News, and even, if anyone still watches it, Channel 4 News, is that if you don't like what you're watching, you can make your displeasure known in the way that matters most and is most keenly felt. If you were annoyed, say, by the coverage of COVID on Sky, you could cancel your subscription. If you felt Channel 4 had become an in-house promotional video producer for Hezbollah, you simply could not watch it anymore. And in theory, at least, that would hit them in the pocket because one fewer person was watching the adverts. The BBC, by contrast, is inoculated from market forces. It gets £3.8 billion every year from licence fee payers, come what may. That doesn't mean the BBC doesn't behave, though, like a rapacious business. As I mentioned earlier, the BBC is likely to get more help over the next couple of years from a Labour government which sees its political fortunes entwined with the survival of the BBC. But the BBC is also increasingly capable of taking care of itself in the way that a gangster would take care of a problem, namely by taking out the competition. If you look at local newspapers, they were once a vibrant part of the warp and weft of local communities. As a side benefit, they also provided a first rung on the media ladder. Jeremy Clarkson, whose cancer diagnosis came as such a shock and sadness to many millions this month, cut his teeth on the local paper, the Rotherham Advertiser. Dozens of these newspapers have gone out of business in recent years. Local news websites run by the BBC, they're not the only reason, but they are a pretty big one. Why was the BBC allowed to use its financial muscle to dominate a shrinking market for local news? You might equally ask why the BBC was permitted to diversify into magazine publishing, which it was. The corporation justified this mission creep by arguing that the profits would be ploughed back into programmes and there'd be less need to increase the licence fee. This was empire building, pure and simple. The impact was felt by businesses that might have thrived had they not faced the suffocating competition of the BBC. But by effectively becoming a publisher as well as a broadcaster, the BBC was expanding its grip on public opinion. Nowhere is this more true than online, the very arena in which many of us imagine the BBC can't stand the heat. 2 years ago, BBC News overtook Apple News to become Britain's most visited news app. Several times a day, staff at the BBC send out push notifications. For subscribers, all 14 million of them, maybe you're one of them, that means an eye-catching, pocket-rattling buzz on their phones several times a day. So what, you may say. Fair play to the BBC for seeing a gap in the market and making tech its friend, not its enemy. Until, that is, you see what this bombardment of push notifications actually looks like in practice. I mean, take migration. Migration may regularly top polls as the thing voters care about the most, but last year, the record day, when 1,000 people crossed the channel in a single day, there was not a single BBC alert about that. But users were told that strictly make sparkling return as new series kicks off. And this is my biggest problem with the BBC. More than any other single institution in Britain today, it seeks to set the tone and the parameters of public debate. Whether it's the audience it chooses for Question Time, or the guests who appear on BBC Breakfast, or who doesn't and does get called far right, the BBC aims to define the Overton window, the term sociologists use to describe the frame of acceptable public discourse. And this is a problem that goes way beyond what appears on BBC News. It's there in every aspect of BBC output. People who like to consider themselves reasonable think it's unreasonable to call for the BBC to lose its public funding. They acknowledge that the corporation gets things wrong, but then they regurgitate a list of things which supposedly only the BBC can deliver: the last night of the proms, natural history programmes, Teletubbies, whatever. Increasingly, however, even these reasonable folks find that their roll call of national treasures is getting shorter. Sports, history, children's programmes have been turned all too often into platforms for social engineering. You will have your own examples that have stuck in your craw. Formerly popular primetime shows like Doctor Who, transformed into one long progressive lecture, or last summer's historical dramatisation of the Battle of Hastings. The BBC cast black actors to play actual noblemen who commanded forces in an historical battle which defined what it was to be English. This wasn't a made-up story. Battle of Hastings. It's a textbook case of diversity-built Britain myth-making, if ever there was. How can you fight back against this ingrained bias? You can complain, and you won't be alone. According to the monitoring group Newswatch, between 2017 and 2025, the BBC had 2.3 million complaints. Of those, nearly 5,000 were taken on by the BBC's complaints unit in-house, where the corporation effectively marks its own homework. 1,000 complaints made it to the regulator Ofcom, which has the power to impose fines, and How many times did Ofcom rule against the BBC from those original 2.3 million complaints? 4 times. In other words, don't bother complaining. But you can hit the BBC where it hurts by cancelling your licence fee. This isn't necessarily as easy as it sounds, particularly right now. You can watch streaming services on your computer or watch nothing but YouTube on your telly. But the moment you watch live or record something that was live on either, or watch anything on the BBC iPlayer, you are on the hook. Which is why during World Cup matches, which tend to be watched live, you might have noticed the BBC flashing up a little QR code on screen accompanied by the soothing voice of a presenter urging you, ever so chummily, to pay your £180 a year. This gentle persuasion rather belies the brute reality of licence fee enforcement. Last year, 25,000 people were fined up to £1,000 for not having a licence, some of them vulnerable, dementia, Down syndrome, or suffering the after effects of a stroke. You cannot be sent to jail for not paying the licence fee, but you can, and people still are, imprisoned for not paying any subsequent fines. 1/3 of all women convicted of a crime in this country were convicted for not paying their TV licence. 1/3. The BBC refuses to decriminalise licence evasion. Imagine YouTube or Netflix or Amazon sending out 46 million leaflets a year, as the BBC does, threatening people with prosecution for not paying. It's a ridiculous anachronism introduced just after the end of World War II, when Britons were conditioned to being pushed around by a state which even told them, through things like rationing, how much they could eat. But this is not the world we live in now, or at least it shouldn't be. The BBC, to be fair, knows this. The licence fee is awkward. It draws attention, embarrassingly, every year to how much we pay for a service many of us actively revile. The corporation would much rather the money got lost in general taxation, the better for us not to notice and complain. BBC may yet get its way. The BBC Charter comes up for renewal next year. Every time you hear a Labour politician talk about our BBC in the way they talk about our NHS, let your ears prick up. We are being softened up for a change in the way we pay for an organisation which often actively campaigns against our way of life, our established traditions, and our national identity. Online, I regularly hear people say you can't hate the BBC enough. I don't hate the BBC. It's where my broadcasting career began. The corporation has made me too happy over the years to feel that way, from comedies like Porridge and Yes Minister to Test Match Special and Letter from America. Its TV and radio output has been part of my life, perhaps yours too. But if hate is too strong, then disgruntlement is too kind. I approach the question of the BBC's future with a kind of grim resignation, and like many licence fee payers, I have reached the point of no return. The BBC must be defunded. Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.